director Isaac Florentine brings us Cold Harvest from 1999. And this one stars Gary Daniels, Brian Genesee and Barbara Crampton. And this is a kind of post-apocalyptic frontier movie. So it is a kind of science fiction movie, but it has trappings and stylistic choices conducive to the Old West. What is the story? Well, effectively we have effectively what has caused the apocalypse. A comet has crashed into the Earth and it wipes out much of humanity. Add to that, it has caused some type of plague to sweep across the world, ultimately killing the vast majority of the survivors. And what is left is effectively a lawless society. However, there is hope. A few individuals have been kind of identified to have a genetic marker which may help provide a kind of antibody or a cure for the kind of the plague. Now, Gary Daniels' character, or I should say characters, he actually has two roles in this movie. He's actually playing twin brothers. One of the brothers, Oliver, is married to Barbara Crampton's character, and he is a carrier of this gene. However, he is killed by a vicious warlord played by Brian Genesee, and his wife, Barbara Crampton, is pregnant and has a marker on the unborn child saying that this unborn child may well have this kind of genetic marker which would help humanity going forward. So it now falls to the other brother, played again by Gary Daniels, to protect his sister-in-law and his unborn niece or nephew against this kind of band of rovers who want this kind of unborn child for themselves. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about what works in Cold Harvest. So Gary Daniels is no kind of stranger to science fiction movies, even to post-apocalyptic movies. Probably most famously, he was in the Fist of the North Star adaptation, the live-action Fist of the North Star adaptation. But this one has that kind of distinct feel because it has this kind of Old West style aesthetic to it as well. It gives it a kind of somewhat of a unique flavour to a certain degree. Of course, we have seen Old West themes incorporated into science fiction before, but you know, it's at least a little bit have its own identity, and it is quite fun. We get the kind of like the Morricone style music. We get the kind of the the kind of like the shootouts with 6 shooters and stuff like that, standoffs. Various kind of like the clothes are kind of fashioned after Old West style kind of like clothing and things like that. So if you're a fan of Western or you're a fan of science fiction, these two genres here are kind of meeting in the middle and giving you this kind of like hybrid movie. So it has this kind of fun aesthetic, which I think gives it a little bit of its own identity. And the 90s, of course, were full of straight-to-video science fiction movies, much of it kind of post-apocalyptic. This movie actually is quite similar to the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie Cyborg in both the kind of the plot and even some of its kind of like elements within the film itself. A lot of kind of action, a lot of kind of kung fu and martial arts. Of course, Gary Daniels is a championship kickboxer. So we get plenty of fisticuffs in this movie as well. And let's talk about those fisticuffs, shall we? Because the fight scenes in this movie are surprisingly good. Actually, far better than I remembered. So I had this film back on VHS. And it was okay, but it was never one of my favourite Gary Daniels movies. But now watching it, I think, wow, do you know what? The fight scenes are actually a little bit more kind of impressive than I remember. They're very much of the kind of the Jackie Chan style, Wai Fu, kind of Hong Kong style of martial arts here. And as such, they're kind of a little bit more over the top, but it gives it this kind of fun comic book kind of aesthetics in some degree. And obviously it's a science fiction movie. These kind of fights seem, people are getting kicked more, and they're flying far more than they would do in real life and spinning around and everything. So it's a little bit over the top, you might say, but it adds that element of kind of fun and kind of like, again, that science fiction kind of element to that fantasy kind of element to it, and it gives it somewhat of a stylistic feel of it too as well, you know. So I think the fight scenes here are very well choreographed. I think they're quite well shot. Florentine obviously has, I mean, he's never directed anything like major, I don't think, but he certainly has, at least in this movie, shown a degree of stylistic choice. Some of the kind of the way these sequences are shot, the angles and things like that, you know, have some style to them. There, some stylistic choices were made, and I think this movie does benefit from that. I'm a huge fan of Gary Daniels. I always have been. I got a, you know, I'll call a spade a spade. I don't think he's the best actor ever, but I think he makes a likeable lead here. And because he plays two roles, albeit one of them is kind of short-lived, you know, it gives him a chance to kind of flex his acting muscles a little bit here. But I quite like this scene, and you know, we do have some dramatic kind of scenes where he learns that, you know, the other twin has been killed and stuff like that. We get a better backstory. I like the fact that we have this. You know, this Gary Daniels' kind of tougher brother, so to speak, is meeting his sister-in-law for the first time, and they're learning about each other. I kind of quite like that. I quite like Barbara Crampton in this movie. She's always watchable as well, isn't she? So we've got two kind of quite watchable leads here, and you know, she actually has something to do. She actually rescues Gary Daniels at one point. And then let's talk about our bad guy, Brian Genesee. He's obviously seen Leon from 1994 and is kind of used, I would say, the Norman Stansfield character as a kind of inspiration for his bad guy. Of course, Norman Stansfield played by Gary Oldman in the movie Leon, aka The Professional. You will see elements of that character, I think, in Genesee's performance here. It's like kind of like bad guy who constantly seems to be kind of chain smoking and is, you know, psychopathic and unpredictable, kind of like Norman Stansfield. So that's quite good. We get some cool sets. We kind of get this kind of, you know, post-apocalyptic world. It all there's fires and there's all dirty people all over the place, and you know, it looks like downtown and everything like that. So I think it's for a low budget movie, for a kind of straight on video at this point, you know, movie. I think it actually looks quite fun and quite, you know, kind of typical of a kind of a wasteland post-apocalyptic style movie. But now that is transition to what doesn't work. I think if I had to have one major criticism of this movie, it does kind of feel somewhat typical of most post-apocalyptic movies. I mean, I don't think it reinvents the wheel. It has some stylistic choices that I think somewhat kind of give it its own identity, but at the same time we have seen plenty of, you know, Old West style science fiction movies, even post-apocalyptic ones, and the story really isn't anything to kind of shout hum about. I mean, Gary Daniels has done more interesting science fiction movies like the movie Spoiler, which I think had a very kind of complex plot actually. It was weird for a Gary Daniels movie. This one, I think it's fine. It's an okay kind of like action film, but it isn't anything you haven't seen before. And I think that the story is remarkably similar to that of Cyborg from 1989 or 1990, whenever that came out. So, you know, it's a lot of what you've seen before. One of the things I maybe wasn't a big fan of here is the way that the Brian Genesee kind of bad guy was handled. Yes, he's borrowing stylistic choices from the performance of Gary Oldman. But we have this kind of like showdown, obviously, with him and Gary Daniels at the end. But there's two problems I have with it. One, the movie always feels like it's leading up to that point, and all of the kind of like the foot soldiers, the other bad guys, just seem like cannon fodder up till that point. The problem is when you focus so much on one bad guy, you know, it's everything else just seems like, you know, you're just cutting through kind of like red shirts at the end of the day. So we're just waiting for the inevitable showdown with the Gary Daniels and Brian Genesee character. The other thing I think they kind of miss a little bit of a trick with him on is the fact that, you know, in the entire movie we see Gary Daniels kicking ass quite a lot with martial arts and kind of fighting and stuff. And then the final kind of like showdown with these two kind of like people, we never really see Brian Genesee do anything quite as impressive until the end, you know, when he's fighting Gary Daniels. So it doesn't really establish that the Brian Genesee bad guy character is a badass at all. He murders a couple of people by simply shooting them, but he's always kind of like sucker punch them, or, you know, shooting someone who's just, you know, defenseless and stuff like that. So he seems kind of slimy and cowardly, but they don't really establish him as a kind of a particularly threatening individual in kind of combat. So when we have that sequence, it almost feels like it comes out of nowhere, because it really hasn't been established that this guy is any type of really physical kind of threat. There are elements that introduce here that I feel are just, nothing is done with them. I mean, we're told that this kind of comet has caused this kind of catastrophe, and we're told it has caused this plague. But we don't really see any plague. There's no kind of like mutant people. There's no people that are infected. The plague is never actually a threat to anyone. It's just there. So we're just told, oh, it's this kind of, we need this cure, but we never actually see it in action in the world. And, you know, we're just told, yeah, it's a comet, and then we just kind of move on. So I think the world is a little bit kind of sloppily kind of put together in some of this kind of like world building and mythology. Why have we adopted this kind of Old West kind of style of gunfights and that sort of thing, and kind of frontier justice? Don't really know. So I think some of the kind of the world building here is just a little bit kind of like, yeah, don't worry about it. We'll just kind of have a few lines of dialogue, and then that's the world, and we kind of won't reference it again. As I mentioned, Gary Daniels, I like him. He's a charismatic kind of like action lead for the kind of the B movies, but he's not the best actor. There's some kind of a few other kind of, you know, typically 1990s straight-to-video performances. Let's not kid ourselves here. And then we get the inevitable. There's a group of kind of like good guys just waiting to rise up against the bad guys. So there's some things, plenty of things you've seen before. However, overall, this is an enjoyable and fun movie, and actually one I've enjoyed more on this rewatch than I actually did when I initially watched it, and kind of just, well, that's one of the sort of straight to kind of like video ones that I kind of forgot about. But I actually do think this movie, for its kind of peers and how it kind of rests among, you know, the other kind of straight-to-video sci-fi movies that we had in the 90s, I actually think this one's actually a bit above average, I have to say. I'll give this one a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Please do let me know, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.